Hello Runeterrans, today Riot spoiled us, and no, I don't just mean because it's spoiler season, I mean because we got another champion reveal. We waited days to get our first champion reveal for the upcoming expansion. We finally got Poppy, and then we turn around and we are gifted Caitlyn on the very next day. Caitlyn is very, very fun in my opinion. I think she might end up being one of my new favorite champions. She is also bringing support to some existing archetypes, and you will see what I mean in just a moment. So let's just dive right in and start talking about Caitlyn. She is a 3-cost Piltover and Zon champion. She is a 3/3 with quick attack, and she reads on strike. You plant 2 flash bomb traps randomly in the top 10 cards of the enemy deck. A flash bomb trap is just like one of Teemo's mushrooms. It will trigger when your opponent draws it. And the flash bomb traps read, deal 1 damage to a random ally. So obviously that's on the opponent's side, and it's going to damage their board. So this is like a board control style trap as opposed to a nexus damage trap like the mushrooms. But I really like that Caitlyn is planting them in the top 10 cards of the deck, because with board control stuff like this, you want a more immediate return. It's also important because of her level up condition. So she levels up when 5 of your traps have been activated. Now, here's the good news. It's just any of your traps. So if you are pairing her with Teemo and with mushroom generators, well, you are going to increase the speed at which you're leveling up Caitlyn. It's also worth noting that her ability triggers on every strike. This is not just Nexus strike. So you get her into combat and she attacks, the quick attack hits, that's 1 plant. Then you turn around and block with her, that's another plant. And you can actually see where defending with her could be very, very interesting if you've got ways to heal her, especially against decks like Azir and Aurelia, where they're constantly throwing 1/1s at you. You could plant an awful lot of flash bombs into the enemy deck. Now, when she does level up, she gets the standard +1/+1, so she becomes a 3-cost 4/4 with quick attack, but her strike changes. It now reads plant 4 flash bomb traps randomly in the top 10 cards of the enemy deck, and deal nexus damage equal to the number of traps that have activated this round. And so if you are again playing her with Teemo, and at the start of the round maybe they take like 2 mushroom damage and 1 flash bomb triggers, well, when you strike with Caitlyn on that round, and again this is strike, not nexus strike, not while attacking, so you can block with her and trigger this. When she strikes, you'll also deal damage to the enemy nexus. I think that's a very interesting concept, because this is one of the few champions where defensively you can threaten lethal if you get to the point where you've leveled her up and you're consistently triggering traps. I also like that it's strike because obviously you can play her with Demacian cards as well, or some of those other options. We've seen a new one from Bandle City, for example, where you are striking enemy units, and as long as Caitlyn is doing the striking, well, you are also activating her ability. What's interesting is we also got a bunch of trap support for Teemo. And I think about somebody like Ava, for example, where she is doubling the damage of your traps. Well, that's also going to apply to Caitlyn and her traps as well, which is, again, very interesting to me. I love the interaction, but we also have additional support for Caitlyn. So we don't have to pair her with Teemo because she's got her own tools as well. Starting with her champion spell, Caitlyn's Piltover Peacemaker. This is a 3-cost Piltover and Zon spell. It is fast speed. It deals 2 damage to an enemy, and then you plant 2 flash bomb traps randomly in the top 10 cards of the enemy deck. So this is a card that will have a regular version as well. So we get the champion spell version, but we also get to run the regular. I normally don't like 3 for 2 as far as like mana to damage ratio, because I think that's usually pretty bad unless you get some other benefit, right? So we've seen like Death's Hand, for example, that gets run because you can trigger Plunder with that. You can get that extra damage in with Swain and his level up, etc., etc. Here we're planting the traps, and so we are really long-term getting 4 damage for 3, because we're getting the initial 2 plus the random 2 that will be done when these traps are drawn. And so really we get a lot of value from this. I think this is one of those cards that might not look great on the surface, but will end up outperforming its expectations. And so big fan of this. We're going to move on to the next graphic though, because again, we have to show Piltover Peacemaker is a regular card, but we also get more trap support on top of a new Karina. We get them in the same package. So Karina Mastermind is a new card. She is a 6-cost 5/5 in Piltover and Zon, and on play does have the skill symbol, so this will be something that you can respond to. But on play, you either plant 5, which is a lot, flash bomb traps randomly. Now this does not say in the top 10 cards, mind you, it just says randomly. Or activate the effects of all traps in the top 5 cards of the enemy deck. Now the reason that I like this is because when you are going for the throat with Teemo, a lot of times you are trying to force your opponent to draw cards. You've planted a bunch of mushrooms and we want them to draw cards, so we trigger traps. Well, Karina here gives us a different way to trigger those traps, and we could potentially use her to blow up a bunch of mushrooms. We could also use her the same way we've used the other Karina in the past, which would be for board control. We could trigger a bunch of flash bombs and potentially get rid of units. A 5/5 for 6, normally you'd either want more stats or better keywords, but we really like the on play effect here. I'm curious to see how much play she's going to get in the archetype, but we do, I think, have an argument that we can make about playing her as a finisher, because again, you can trigger a bunch of mushrooms, which could just close out the game. We get more trap support in the next card that was revealed, and that is Justice Rider. This is a 4-cost 3/4 in Piltover and Zaun, and it reads, whenever your opponent draws, plant 1 flash bomb trap randomly in the top 10 cards of the enemy deck. Now, at first I was like, well, this is a 4-cost 3/4. We don't have any keywords. We don't get an immediate effect. We're not really a huge fan of that, but what I really like about the design of this card is that it rewards you for doing the thing you already want to do, which is make your opponent draw cards. And we are further punishing them for doing what they want to do, which is likely draw cards. So we are saying, hey, whenever you draw, we're planting a trap, but also we want to make you draw because we want our traps to go off. And so we create this double-edged sword where if we're playing some of the cards, whether it's the Foundry or the Investigator, when we're playing some of these cards that make our opponents draw, we're also getting a kickback of further planting traps. We're, in many ways, we're kind of negating the negative that comes with the force your opponent to draw portion. A lot of times we're forcing them to draw because we want them to take mushroom damage, or at least that's the way it was in the past. But then we would have to deal with whatever it was that they drew. Whereas here with this, we're saying, okay, well, you might draw more threats, but we're planting more traps. So those are going to have to be bigger because we're also pressuring your board with these flash bombs. And so I just really like the design. I'm, again, still not super thrilled about the stats for the cost, but we like this as like a nice backline option. I don't know if this is going to be as important as like Puffcat Peddler is. That card is still going to be a mainstay, I think, in all trap decks, but we could maybe see this experimented with. I don't know. I just like the design more than anything. Whether it ends up seeing competitive play or not, really like the way that they approached this card. Now, we also have Officer Squad on this graphic. This is a 5-cost 4/5, no keywords. So again, we're kind of left with that. You know, I wish it had slightly better stats. I wish it had a keyword, but when I'm summoned, you create a Most Wanted in hand. Now, Most Wanted here is a 5-cost slow spell, and this reads, pick a player to discard their lowest cost card to draw 3. I love this because we get a lot of versatility out of this. We could use this on ourselves to pitch a card that just might not be relevant, and then we could draw 3. If we have next to no hand, we could just be throwing away our hand to draw 3 new cards, which we know is very good from some other decks and some other archetypes. But we also can target our opponent, which would then in turn not only get rid of whatever their lowest cost card is, but we also make them draw 3, and we're playing traps in all likelihood. And so when we're talking about ways to make your opponent draw because we want to trigger those traps, well, making them draw 3 is very attractive. That being said, again, not really a huge fan of the cost to stat line. Really wish this had some sort of keyword, even if it was like a tune or whatever, but I do like Most Wanted. I'm interested in seeing how we can utilize that, and I'm going to keep my eye on this one. I'm a little unsure. With that being said, we're going to move on to the final graphic for the reveals, and we're going to start with Station Archivist. I love this card. Station Archivist is a 3-cost Piltover and Zaun unit. It's got a 3/3 body, but on play, you pick a spell that's in the top 5 cards of your deck, and you create an exact fleeting copy in hand. We can come up with some wacky stuff for this. We get to dig, and in many control decks or slower decks, we're already enjoying that. Even if we just get like an extra Mystic Shot, we're probably happy. even in aggro, let's be honest, if we're looking for burn, we might be happy with that outcome. A 3-cost 3/3 that also gives us a reliable effect could be huge. But when we start talking about the memes and the wackiness and the kinds of things that I'm hoping to make multiple copies of, we got to talk about stuff like Death from Below, right? Because if you're running a Pike deck, now granted, you're not normally running that with Piltover and Zon, but we do have cards that copy things. We could maybe get some mileage with Lurk. We do have Predict in that region, so it's not super outlandish. It's not going to be competitive, but it's not super outlandish. But if we get to the point where we know our Pike is on top, whether it's through Predict or whatever, and then we attack, we make sure he becomes Death from Below, well, we could play Archivist, and then that creates a copy of Death from Below for us to play, and then we draw the other one as well. And so there's a lot of really, I think, neat things that you can do with this card. I think that, if I'm being entirely honest, it would not shock me if this ends up becoming part of a really busted or broken combo deck, because we like copying spells, we like being able to play additional ones, and we also like putting bodies on the board when we need to block and kind of develop into whatever our combo is. So I'm a big fan of this on the surface. I love everything that it's doing. As I said before, we could end up just seeing this played in burn decks as well, as another way to play Get Exciteds, another way to play Mystic Shots, because we like direct damage too. But big fan of Station Archivist here. Next up, we have Sting Officer. This is a 2-cost Piltover and Zon unit. It's got a 2/1 body with the elusive keyword, so we're already a fan. But it also says on Nexus Strike, we plant 2 flash bomb traps randomly in the top 10 cards of the enemy deck. So we get some proactive support. We really like this when we are talking about the kinds of decks where you want to be proactive but also have disruption. So when you're thinking about like prank decks, where you're maybe using elusives and then you're using pranks to slow down your opponent from properly dealing with your little units, well, Sting Officer kind of fits that build as well, because we're making it so that maybe their board starts taking damage, and while we're not being direct in our answers, we're at least threatening, like, hey, something bad could happen, or the wrong unit dies at the wrong time, and we can take advantage of that. We can capitalize on it. So I can see Sting Officer definitely finding a home, and we're for sure going to be seeing it in the Caitlyn Teemo decks. I'm almost positive. We want to plant more traps to begin with, but we like elusive in those lists as well. Speaking of elusive, we've got another really great reveal here. This is Ambush. It is a 2-cost burst spell from Piltover and Zon, and it says give a unit +2/+0 this round. If you've added 2 or more cards to your hand this round, give it elusive. So we get a 2-cost +2 spell, which is already probably playable, but we also get a conditional ghost that we can add, and we get this in a region that gets to run like Vi, for example, and our conditional cost is very easy to hit. Wow, I cannot wait to be swinging with like 12 attack Vi's elusive because of Ambush. It's going to be absurd. This card is very good. Would not shock me if it ends up being adjusted at some point, because we really like everything about this, whether it is in a trap centric deck where you're playing this with chump wumps, because again, we can satisfy that condition very easy to give something elusive. And even though it's only for a round, right, if we're playing a chump wump and then we get to swing with it with Ambush, we get to threaten 6 damage elusive just from that play. But we also get the cool combo aspect, like I said, where you can play it with Vi or some other similar champion where you're also giving them that ghost effect, right? We're giving them elusive. This is huge, and I'm a big fan. Now, speaking of huge additions, we also have Coupe de Grace. And yes, I know I'm slaughtering that. If you're French, I'm sorry. It's just something I do because I find it funny. But I have to say, this card is another one that I'm very excited about. We had talked about in the Poppy video how Demacia didn't have a ton of direct answers, and so we were kind of excited for her slow spell that's going to be putting things on the top of the opponent's deck. Well, Piltover and Zon is another region where you don't traditionally have true hard removal. In fact, we've been relying on like transform effects in the past, and that was so bad that we just didn't really see competitive decks using it. But we might be seeing this. This is a pretty good answer. So this is a 5-cost spell. It's fast speed, and it says place an enemy follower into the enemy deck, then your opponent draws 1. Now, why do we like this? Well, we just answer a unit, and now it has to be a follower. That is the one downside where the Poppy spell just hits anything. So we do have to target followers, but we just answer it. We don't have to worry about damage or anything like that. And we make our opponent draw one, and we're likely playing traps. So we're taking that negative and turning it into a positive. I kind of love that Piltover and Zaun is the region that takes negatives and turns them into positives, because we have discard as a theme in the region, and now we have all these effects where we're like, hey, we're just gonna let our opponent draw cards. Oh, by the way, not really the negative that it sounds like. So again, we're a big fan of this as well. I love what it's going to bring to the region, and we're just pushing this, you know, turn drawbacks into positives. We're going to continue that trend of talking about drawbacks that are not really drawbacks, and we're going to talk about Insider Knowledge. This is a 3-cost Piltover and Zaun spell. It's fast speed, and it says both players draw 2 cards. Now, paying 3 to draw 2 is a pretty standard thing in Legends of Runeterra. That's kind of the go-to rate, but we get to force our opponent to draw. And so in trap decks, we like this. Obviously, it helps us, but it also in many ways kind of hinders our opponent. It helps them too, but it hinders them because we want those traps to be triggered. What I'm most curious about with this card specifically is whether or not this ends up replacing Foundry, because we know that in old Teemo decks of the past, we would be running Hex Core Foundry because we want the long-term benefits, but we also then had to kind of commit to it, and sometimes that left us a bit more vulnerable. We also might have to commit to it before we've laid our traps, which could be an issue. Whereas if you're just using Insider Knowledge, then you get to dictate exactly when the triggers go off, but we don't get that round after round after round benefit. So I don't know if we want to run both, or if you do, what kind of numbers you want to use there, because we don't want too many draw effects. We don't want our deck to be full of like just feeding our opponent cards. We want to be able to lay our traps first, load things up nice and good, and then make them draw a bunch of cards. If we're doing it too early, I think that's a bit of a negative, but we do, I think, likely run some number of these. I just don't know if it's going to replace Foundry, be on top of Foundry. If you're going to go with more like a 2-and-2 split, whatever the case may be, we're going to have to do some testing, figure out where this card belongs. But I like it. I like the design. I love what Piltover and Zaun is doing here, and I love most of the reveals today. And we're going to end on Advanced Intel. This is a 1-cost burst spell, again from Piltover and Zaun, and it very simply reads, plant 2 flash bomb traps randomly in the top 10 cards of the enemy deck. So this is kind of like the Mushroom Cloud, but for Caitlyn's traps, and we're maybe the least excited about this. Like, we understand why it exists. I don't know if we're going to be including it in our main deck unless we just really want something for spell count. We might see other cards that maybe creates these, even if it's not now, it might be further down the line. We might get like the Chump Wump version of this, if you will, but we're going to end on that one. I know it's kind of sad to end on the least exciting one, but we got a lot of great stuff here. I want to know what you think about it. I want to know what decks you're going to jam Caitlyn into. Obviously, Teemo is going to be a thing. Caitlyn Teemo is absolutely going to be an archetype, but A, you know, what regions are you pairing them with? And B, what other decks, if it's not Teemo, are you considering playing Caitlyn in? Because again, I really like the idea of trying to utilize her strike abilities and kind of like playing defense, but still threatening damage with something like Demacia, where you can jam in a bunch of strikes. But if you made it this far, as always, I appreciate you. Thank you for watching. If you're new, consider subscribing. And until next time, may you walk on warm sands.